All right, everybody, this is a big one, so I'm hoping that I can keep this video down to a manageable time frame. But we're going to talk about looping control structures. So let's just dive in. Okay, so we've already learned about one type of control structure, which is our if statements and its variations. If statements control the flow of code. We saw that depending on how our if statement works, depending on some conditions in our program, an if statement might run one block of code and not run another. Another type of control structure in programming is called loops. And there's a couple of different types of loops. So what a loop does is it allows you to repeat code. You can repeat a block of code a specific number of times, or you can keep repeating a block of code while a certain condition remains true, like we'd use a Boolean expression for that. So there's a couple of different types of loops, and depending on what you're trying to do, some work better than others. Now, I'm not covering all types of loops here, so we'll just cover two of them in this exercise. So let's start with the while loop. A while loop will continue to repeat code as long as a Boolean expression evaluates to true. Okay, now I know this sounds weird. Let's go over the syntax first. Okay, here we go. So right here in the first example, it starts with this special keyword while, and then after the while we have parentheses, and then what goes inside the parentheses is a Boolean expression, and we'll talk about that. And then after the parentheses we have a pair of curly braces. So here's my beginning curly brace right here, and then here's the closing curly brace right here. And what goes in between the curly braces is what we call the body of the loop. So that's the code that's going to repeat while this loop is running. So okay. So go ahead and eyeball that syntax and we'll start using it. So I know, let's just try a real example here to get started. That'll hopefully make this stuff will make more sense then. Okay, so we know that a while loop continues as long as a Boolean expression evaluates to true. So you might wonder, well, how would that expression change from true to false? So what usually happens with the while loop is some code in the body of the loop will change a variable or change something that will cause the Boolean expression to evaluate to false, and then the loop will terminate. So what does that mean? Here I've got a good example to explain this. So let's go ahead and this is the second code block. Let's go ahead and copy this and then paste it over into Sublime Text here. So I've got the file open. I'm going to scroll on down to where the script tag is, and I'm not sure where it is. I got to look for it here. It's probably around line 246 for me, so it should be roughly around there, but maybe not, depending on if I made changes to the file. So I'll go ahead and paste this code right in there, and then I'm going to just format it a little bit. So let's see what we got here. So I've got a variable that I'm declaring called guess, and notice that it's not initialized. So I think we touched on this in an assignment, but I don't remember if we actually talked about it. But if you don't initialize a variable, it has a special value which we call undefined, or some other languages call it null. But anyways, that's kind of a side note right now. But so this variable is declared but has no value. It hasn't been initialized. Okay, so now here's our while loop starting right here, and here's our parentheses. Here's what's in our parentheses. This is a Boolean expression. So what we're doing here is we're saying, while guess is not equal to this value, George Washington, then we're going to continue to loop. Okay, so like I said, guess has no value, so it's not equal to George Washington because that is a value, and that makes this Boolean expression true because they are not equal. Guess is undefined, and George Washington is George Washington. So, and we're using the not equal operator, so this Boolean expression will evaluate to true. Well, now let's move to the body of the loop here. So this is only one line of code. Usually there's a lot more than just one line of code, but look what it's doing here. We're doing a prompt, and then whatever the user enters in the prompt is going to get assigned to this variable guess. So the prompt says, who was the first president of the United States? All right, so let's say I enter Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so we come to the end of our loop and then we repeat the loop. So at this point, we're going to run this Boolean expression again. Now this time, guess is holding Abraham Lincoln, and what we're looking for is George Washington. So this Boolean expression is going to evaluate to true because Abraham Lincoln is not equal to George Washington. That's true. So we loop again. So we dive into the body of the loop. This code runs, and let's say this time I enter George Washington. And by the way, JavaScript is case sensitive, so I have to enter it with the proper case, capital G and capital W. So let's say I do that. Now guess is storing a value of George Washington. We come to the end of our loop and the loop repeats, so it goes back up to the top, and we reevaluate the Boolean expression. This time, guess evaluates to George Washington, and we're comparing it to George Washington, so we're saying George Washington is not equal to George Washington. That's false. And as soon as that Boolean expression turns to false, the loop terminates, and we jump down to the code after the loop. So in that case, we'd see this alert right here run. So let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to save this code, bounce back over to the browser, hit refresh here, and so here's my prompt. Who was the first president of the United States? And I'm just going to enter garbage first, and now it's asking me again because that loop's continuing. So this time I'll enter George Washington, and hopefully I got that right, and I'll click OK here, and now we break out of the loop. Okay, so that's while loops. Okay, I'm going to close this. Now we're going to move on to for loops next. Those are a little more complicated, but before we do, I want to point out that another word for looping is called iterating right here, and this is important. Each time, this sentence right here is important. Each time the code in the body of a loop executes, it's said to be an iteration of the loop. So an iteration is when the body of the loop, the code inside the body of the loop executes. Okay, let's move on to for loops here. So while loops depend on Boolean expressions, and for loops do too, but they also have another twist in them. For loops have a built-in counter that can count the number of loops that are occurring, and we'll see how that works in a second here. So let's talk about the syntax first, and this is a little bit hairy, I have to admit, so this is going to take some getting used to. But what we've got here is a keyword for, and then parentheses. So here's so after the for comes parentheses, and then there's a bunch of stuff inside the parentheses. And then we'll talk about that in a second. After the parentheses is a pair of curly braces. So here's my starting curly brace and my ending curly brace. And what goes inside the curly braces is the code that we want to loop. Okay, so, and I've just got a comment in here for now. Okay, so now there's three parts to the stuff that goes inside the parentheses. The first one is we're going to initialize a counter variable. Okay, and I'm just going to tell you real quick here, and I think the easiest way is to see a real example. So I'll kind of fly through this part here. So part one is a variable that serves as our counter. It's our counter variable. And then all these parts are separated by semicolons. So this syntax will trip you up. You got to really pay attention. After the semicolon comes the second part, which is a Boolean expression. So this loop, like a while loop, this loop is going to run as long as this Boolean expression evaluates to true. Okay, now then that's the third part, which comes after this semicolon here, is a little piece of code that's going to increment our counter. So remember, we set up a counter over here. Okay, now that probably makes no sense at all to you at this point, but let's just take a look at a real example to see to help us out here. So I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to copy this code right here. This is our first for loop, our real one. The one above was just showing the syntax. So I'll copy that, go on over to Sublime Text. I'll get rid of the example that we just ran, and then I'll go ahead and paste this code in here, do a little bit of formatting, get it set up nice and neat. And so here we go. Here's our keyword for, and then we have our parentheses after that. After our parentheses, we have our curly braces. So here's the opening curly brace, here's the closing curly brace. What goes in between the curly braces? is the code that's going to run while this loop is iterating. Okay, let's go back to the parentheses. The first part, we set up a counter variable. So I'm declaring a variable. I'm calling it x. I can call it whatever I want, but in this case I'm calling it x, and I'm initializing it to 0. Okay, that's the first part. And then we have a semicolon. Now the second part is a Boolean expression, and it's saying x is less than 3. So remember, we're initializing x to 0, and our Boolean expression is we're going to keep looping as long as x is less than 3. So then we have a semicolon, and then the third part here is x plus plus. So this tells us what to do with x when we complete an iteration. So at the end, when the body of the code, the code in the loop body is what I'm trying to say, when that finishes, then x is going to get updated by 1 here. So you'll remember that the plus sign is what we call the increment operator, and that will increment x 1 by 1 every time. So let's dive into this loop right here. So here's our setup. We got x is equal 0. We're going to run this loop until x is less than 3, and at the end of each iteration we're going to increment x by 1. Okay, so right now x is 0 and our Boolean expression is true because x is less than 3. So we dive into the body of the loop, and here we're just console.logging out a string, and we're concatenating x into the string. So the first time through, x is 0, it's going to say looping x is 0. That's what we're going to see in the console, and we'll run this in a second. So we get to the end of the loop, and then our incrementer kicks in. So at this point, this is x plus plus is going to magically turn x from 0 into a 1. And then the loop repeats, or I'm sorry, before the loop repeats, we evaluate our Boolean expression. So x just got changed to 1. 1 is less than 3, so we're going to continue this loop. So we'll see a console log again. This time it'll say looping x is equal to 1. We get to the end of this iteration, and x gets incremented by 1 again. So now x is 2. So and 2 is less than 3, so that's still true. So we're going to loop one more time. So this time it's going to dump out 2 in our console.log. And then when the body of the loop completes, x is going to get incremented to 3. Okay, so then we go back up to the top here and we reevaluate this expression. Now this time x is 3. This is false. So at this point the loop terminates, and then it would the code that would be after the for loop down here would run at that point then. Okay, that's a long explanation. Let's run this here. I'm going to save this code. I'm going to go back over to the browser. I'm going to open up the developer tools by pressing F12, and I'm going to click on the console button. By the way, I'm going to get rid of these errors and warnings here. I don't want to see those anymore. Those have been kind of in the way. I can show you how to do that later. I'm just getting rid of some CSS errors that were appearing. So I'll refresh here, and here's our output here. So looping x is 0, x is 1, x is 2. Now when I first started learning how to code, I would like walk through these for loops like we just did a lot just to get the hang of them, and so they do take some getting used to. So okay, so I'll go ahead and close the console, and let's take a look at what's next here. Loops and arrays. Okay, loops and arrays go together like milk and Oreos. They work together very well, because a lot of times what we do is we loop through the contents of an array, and when we do that, we can process the data and work with the data that's in an array. So we use loops and arrays together quite a bit, and it really gives us a lot of power in the programs that we write. So what we do here is we use our counter variable. In the last example, that variable was called x. We use that as an index number when we're pulling elements out of an array. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at this code here. So let's go ahead and copy this code, copy it, and then go over to Sublime Text here, and I'll get rid of the previous one, and then I'll paste this in and do a bit of formatting here like that, get everything lined up nice and neat. So what I've got here is an array of strings, Bob, Betty, and Keith, and that's in an array that we call names. That's our variable name. And we should know by now that arrays are objects and they have properties, and one of the properties of an array is the length property, so we can use that to find out how many elements are in an array. So and we're taking that and we're assigning that length to this loop count variable. So this is going to be 3. Loop count is going to evaluate to 3, and then we've got our loop here. Okay, so we initialize our counter variable and set it to 0. Now we're setting it to 0 because 0 is the first index number in arrays, in an array. Okay, so we set x equal to 0, and then what we're going to do is we're going to continue this loop while x is less than our loop count, and we said our loop count is 3. So this evaluates to 3 in this case. And then we've got our incrementer here, and then we dive into our loop. So let's see what's going on inside of our loop. So this line right here, that first line is declaring a variable called current name, and look what it's doing here. It's pulling the value of an element out of this array. And in this case, x evaluates to 0, so we can just put a 0 there for now, and what we'll get out of it is the first element in the array. So that's Bob. So the first time in the first iteration, current name is going to get set to Bob. Now I called it current name because that's oftentimes when we're looping through an array, we call it the current element, meaning the element that we're pulling out of the array and currently working with. So I think you'll see that current used quite a bit in my code, and that just refers to the current element in the array that we're working with. So that's why I called it current name. So we pull Bob out of the names array, and then we basically just log that out. And we're logging the value of the element, and we're also logging its index number here, which happens to be the same as our counter variable. Because remember, we're using the counter variable as the index right here to pull values out of the array. All right, let's run this code here. So I'm going to save this, go over to the browser, hit F12, and then refresh. So look at what we got here. Bob is at index 0, Betty's at index 1, Keith is at index 2. So if you're following along, and you can play with this code and dink around with it and experiment with it, but you're doing pretty good if you're catching all this, because we're only 17 minutes into this video at this point. So I want to show you something else now. This next example is basically the same exact thing as what I just showed you, but we're not using some variables, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's copy that code, take it on over to Sublime Text, and I'll go ahead and delete what we had before, and then paste this in, do some formatting like that, and here we go. Like I said, this is very similar to what we had before. We've got that same array, a names array full of 3 names. And now in this case, I'm not using any variable, I'm not creating any new variables inside my loop. So before I had a variable called loop count, but I can just get the number that I want. I can just get that directly from the array itself by calling the length property. So you'll see this a lot when you're looping through arrays. It'll be the array name here, or the variable that's representing the array, and then the dot operator, and then the length property. So a lot of times when you're looping through arrays, that's what you'll see here. And then notice in the previous example, I created a variable called current name, and then I assigned names x to it. Well, I don't necessarily need that variable. I can just get it straight from the array if I want to. So there's reasons why you'd want to create variables, and sometimes you don't have to. If I was gonna, we'll talk about that in class, but remind me to bring that up. But I can get away with not creating extra variables, and some programmers think it's better to be concise. But sometimes concise is confusing. So sometimes when your code is, just because you write more code doesn't mean that it's bad. But anyways, that's kind of a side note here. So. Okay, moving on here, let's go back over to our page and see where we're at. Whoops, there we go. Okay, so now we can break out of loops early if we need to, and I'll give you a good example of why you might do that. So let's go ahead and copy this code, take it on over to Sublime Text. I'll go ahead and delete what we had in there before, and whoops, paste it, And now this is a big chunk of code, so go ahead and indent it properly. And okay, so we've got an array here. I've got an array of strings. So I've got Tom, Betty, Joe, Sarah, Sally, Jesse, Luther, Morton, and whoever else is running out. I guess Morton's the last one. And then I've got a variable called search for, and the value that's getting assigned is this prompt here. So it's going to say enter an employee to look up. Okay. And then I've got a variable that I've declared and I haven't initialized at this point. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to allow you to look up employees from our array. This is a really crude and simple example, but this is when computing becomes powerful, is when you can do search type things. This is a very simple one, but anyways, you can use loops to search through an array to search for certain values. Okay, so whatever they enter into this prompt is what we're looking for. So what we want to do then is we want to loop through the array and search for a name in the array that matches this variable, because that's what the user entered into the prompt. Okay, so here's our loop. Our counter variable x is set to 0, starts off as 0, and we're going to loop as long as x is less than the length of the array, and we're going to increment by 1 here. And then look at what we're doing here. We're saying if the current employee, so employees x, is equal to what we're searching for, then our job's done, right? We don't need to keep looping, because as soon as we find what we're looking for, we're just wasting time, energy, and CPU power by continuing the loop. So if we're done with our search, then we can break out of it. So that's this break statement right here. So it's just the word break, and that's a statement, so it ends with a semicolon. So if we found our employee the first time through, let's say we entered Tom, and Tom happens to be the first name in our array, then we could break out of the array here, and then we'd be done with the entire for loop. So we'd be terminating the for loop here, and we'd move on to the next code after the for loop. So see, what we're doing here is we're saying, before the for loop, we've got this variable that's not initialized, so it has no value, it's undefined. If we find what we're looking for, then we're going to initialize that variable and it will have a value. Let's just say we don't find what we're looking for, then that's why we have this if statement right here. So if we find what we're looking for, this is how we can test to see if we found what we're looking for, because if we did, then selected employee will have been initialized. If we didn't find what we're looking for, then selected employee will not have been initialized. So anyways, if we found the selected employee, we can alert their name. If we didn't find the selected employee, then we can alert this message that says we can't find the selected employee. Okay, I want you to run this code. I'm not going to run it because this video is getting kind of long, but please run this code and play with it and try to understand it. And please come to class with questions if anything's stumping you, because there's a lot going on here. Okay? All right, where are we at? 2 more things real quick. I'll bounce back over to the web page here. So if that didn't confuse you, then check this out. We can nest loops inside of other loops. So we can have a loop, and inside the body of that loop is another loop. And you might think to yourself, why the heck would you ever want to do that? Well, believe me, it comes in really handy, especially when you're working with tabular data, when you're working with data that is organized in rows and columns, because you can loop through the rows, and then when you're looping through a row, you can loop through the columns in a row. So we actually use nested loops quite a bit, but I'm hitting you hard with this loop stuff here. So anyways, go down to this code sample here. Let's copy that and then take it on over to Sublime Text, and we'll delete what we had here before, and then we'll paste this in. Now, oh yeah, see, now this is running off the page here, but I'm going to go ahead and format this anyways. Oh geez, where does it go? So by now, hopefully you're getting used to this formatting stuff, so I got everything kind of lined up right. I have a function that I created, and then here's actually my outer loop right here, and then here's my inner loop. So I was looking at this function and for some reason thinking it was my loop, but anyway, sorry about that. So let's see what's going on here. So we've got two variables here, row count and column count, and they're getting set to what the user enters into a prompt. So we're saying, first of all, how many rows would you like in your table? And then whatever they enter is going to be stored in row count. So that's going to be how many rows they want. And then how many columns do you want in each row? So that's going to be stored in column count. And then what we're doing is invoking this function that I created, and we're passing in the row count and column count as parameters. So we're invoking create grid, that's my function, and we're passing in the row count and the column count. Okay, now here's the declaration for that create grid function. Okay, and here are the parameters. So this is going to be what, when this function runs, whatever they entered for rows and columns are going to be represented by these parameters right here. Okay, so what we've got here is I created a variable that I'm going to use here, and this is just going to be what we're going to use to build up a string. So this variable is going to get built up while our loop runs. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to do a loop that starts at 1 this time, not at 0. We can start loops wherever we want. This one's starting at 1. I'm not dealing with an array here. And we're going to loop while r is, and by the way, r is our counter variable. We're going to loop while r is less than or equal to whatever they entered for the row count. So inside of our function, that row count is referred to as rows because that's our parameter name up here. Okay, so we're going to loop from starting at 1 until we hit whatever they entered for the row count, and we're going to increment by 1. And then we're going to use this current row variable and do some string concatenation with it. So I'll let you guys look at this. But anyways, so once we're building a row, we have to build all the columns inside the row, and that's why we have this inner loop right here. Okay, now this is probably the nastiest line of code in this whole thing. So anyways, our inner loop is going to be for the number of columns that they entered into the prompt. So anyways, please take a look at this, but this is just building up a string, and let me know what we need to talk about here. So eyeball this code. If you can understand all this, you're doing great. Then if you can't understand it, make sure you ask, bring up some questions in class. And a lot of times it's hard to articulate questions, but just say, I don't get it, and hopefully we'll get a discussion going here. But anyways, go ahead and save this code, open up the browser, hit F12 to open the console, and then hit refresh, and here you go. How many rows would you like in your table? I'm just going to say 10 and hit OK. And then how many cells would you like in each row? I'm just going to say 15 and then hit OK, and here we go. Now here's our little matrix or our grid or whatever, and what I did is I'm labeling each cell. So this is cell 1, meaning row 1, cell 1, row 1, cell 2, and so on and so forth, and then we go down to row 2. Okay, so see if you can figure out what's going on here, but we can do a lot of powerful things with nested loops. Okay, gosh, we're going along here. I got one more thing to show you. So I will close the console here, and the last thing I want to show you is that we can loop through an array of objects. So we've been talking a lot about objects in this course, and I just want to show you, and when we start looping through arrays of objects, then our programs can do a lot of processing, and we work with those objects as we loop through them, and we can write some really cool programs when we loop through arrays of objects. So what I've got here is an array. I'm going to go ahead and copy this into our Sublime Text, and I want you to do that too. So copy that last code chunk, go on over to Sublime Text. Let's erase everything inside that script tag. So here we go. We got the empty script tag here. I'll paste this in, and then I have to do some indentation to fix everything like that. Okay, that looks good to me. So I've got an array of objects. So here's the first object. Each object has a first name and a last name property. So this is an array of objects that represent people. Okay, so here's my array of objects, and now I'm looping through that array. So set up our counter, and since the array starts at 0, we're going to set our counter to start at 0 too. We're going to loop as long as x is less than the length of our array, which is going to be 4. So we can basically this is basically just a placeholder for 4 in this case, and then our incrementer here, and then We dive into the body of the loop, and we've got a variable called person, and this is just going to represent the current object in our array. So I could have called this current person, maybe that would have been better, but anyways, hopefully you get the idea. So the important thing to note here is that person here is going to be an object. So the first time through the loop, person is going to be containing this guy right here. So that's an object that has properties. So let's say what I want to do here is I want to display each person's full name. So the next line down in the body of the loop is a variable declared called full name, and look at what we're setting that to. We're concatenating a string here, and we're concatenating the first name and the last name of the current object, or I've called it person here, and then we just console.log it. Alright, so I'm going to save this, go over to the browser, hit F12, and then hit refresh here, and there you go. So now we're displaying the full names of our people in our people array. Okay, that went longer than I wanted it to. I'm going to get out of here.